Rosalind Chase was 23 years old when the railway superintendent stood on the platform of the Ashford Junction depot in front of half the town and declared that the station clock she had serviced only a week before it stopped at the exact hour 2 freight. Trains met head-on in the fog, and she was escorted from her father's shop that same afternoon with nothing but a small leather roll of jeweler's tools, a loop on a cord around her neck, and a single broken pocket watch she had never found time to finish repairing for herself. She had no family left to shelter her, no engineer willing to speak for her, and no reason to expect that a single soul in Ashford Junction would ever look past the nearest hand to find the truer cause. But what the superintendent and the railway board did not know was that a full day's walk south, in an abandoned clockmaker's workshop, the county had shuttered years before. The plain unwelcome truth of what had actually stopped that clock had been waiting inside a broken mechanism, sealed in a drawer nobody thought to open, for someone patient enough to take it apart and read what it remembered. Settle in and stay close, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight. To understand what happened to Rosalind Chase in the autumn, a railway's convenient blame took her family's good name down with it. You have to understand the trade that raised her, and the particular quiet discipline a clockmaker's daughter learns long before she learns to trust her own hands completely. Her father, a clockmaker named Ezekiel Chase, had kept the only reliable shop for repairing fine mechanisms in 3 counties, a reputation built over 20 years of service to farmers who needed a dependable pocket watch, and, more recently, to the railway itself, which had come to depend on his steady hands to keep its station clocks and dispatchers' timepieces synchronized to the exact minute a schedule required. Rosalind's mother had died when Rosalind was 7, and Ezekiel, left alone with a daughter and a trade that rewarded patience above nearly every other virtue, had raised her at his workbench, setting a set of tiny brass gears into her small hands before she was old enough to hold a proper conversation, teaching her, long before she learned her letters, that a clock was nothing more than a conversation between dozens of small parts, each one keeping faith with all the others, and that the smallest untrue tooth on the smallest gear could, given enough time, throw the whole mechanism into silence. By the time she was 11, Rosalind could disassemble and reassemble a simple mantel clock blindfolded, purely by feel, and by 16, her father trusted her completely with regulating a railway timepiece, because her hands, smaller and steadier than his own aging fingers, could feel an imbalance in a hairspring that his had begun to lose the sensitivity to detect. Ezekiel told her once, in the plain, unhurried way he told her most things that mattered, that a mechanism, properly built and properly kept, would run true for 100 years, and that when a clock failed without visible cause, the failure almost never lived in the clock itself, but in something done to it from outside, a hand that had reached in where no hand belonged. This was the standard that had, 3 years before the collision, earned the Chase name the exclusive contract to service every clock along the Ashford Junction rail line, a commission Ezekiel had poured more care into than into any work he had done before. The trouble began, though neither Rosalind nor her father understood it as trouble at the time, when a new station master named Horace Winslow arrived to oversee the junction the year before the collision, a smooth and ambitious man carrying gambling debts from the capital that his modest salary could never hope to cover, debts owed to men whose patience had already run out. Winslow had noticed in his first months at the junction that a single hour's confusion between 2 converging lines, blamed convincingly on a faulty clock, would trigger an insurance settlement large enough to satisfy every creditor pressing him, and that the easiest hand to blame for such a failure would always be the clockmaker's, since a mechanism, once broken, rarely explained itself to anyone without the training to read it properly. On the night before the collision, Winslow let himself into the depot's clock tower after the last dispatcher had gone home, and using tools he had quietly acquired from a supplier 2 counties distant, he worked a small file against a single brass tooth deep inside the mechanism, weakening it just enough that it would hold through the day's ordinary use and fail only under the strain of the following dawn's heavier fog-delayed traffic. Time to stop the clock at precisely the hour 2 freight trains, would otherwise have passed each other safely on a siding. When the collision came, sparing lives only because both engineers caught sight of each other's headlamp through the fog with seconds to spare, the railway's own inspector examined the stopped clock and found, correctly, a single failed tooth deep inside the escapement, though his hurried conclusion, reached under pressure from a railway eager to settle the matter, named only substandard maintenance as the cause, since a filed tooth and a naturally fatigued one looked, to an inspector without a clockmaker's trained eye, very much the same. The railway board met within days and stripped Ezekiel Chase of his contract entirely, seizing his tools and his shop's credit as surety against the damages. And Ezekiel, his health already fragile and his spirit broken, took a smaller position 2 counties west repairing farm implements, a trade far beneath what his hands had once been capable of, and he left Rosalind, now 23, a handful of days to arrange her own path before the shop passed entirely into a creditor's hands. Rosalind did not weep in the empty workshop where her father's tools had once hung in careful rows, and instead she packed the leather roll of jeweler's tools that were legally hers, the loop she had worn every working day since she was 16, and the one broken pocket watch of her own she had never found time to finish repairing, and she set out, not toward the county where her father now labored under another man's judgment, but south toward an old clockmaker's workshop she remembered her father once mentioning, shuttered years before, when its owner, a solitary craftsman with no family to inherit his trade, had died and left the county unwilling to spend the money clearing it out. She walked the better part of a day, reaching the workshop as the light was failing, a narrow stone building with a cracked front window and a door swollen shut with years of damp. And inside, the air was cold and close and smelled of dust and old brass polish, in a way that told her plainly no one had crossed that threshold since its last owner. She built a small fire that first night, and in the morning, restless and unable to simply wait for a railway inquiry that might never truly examine what it did not want to find, she began to clear the workbench of dust and fallen debris. And it was while opening a warped drawer beneath the bench that she found, tucked in the back corner behind a scatter of loose screws, a single pocket watch, its case dented, its crystal cracked, clearly set aside by its owner as broken beyond the ordinary bother of repair. She lifted it into the light and turned it over in her palm, and on the back of the case engraved in small, careful script were the initials of a man she did not recognize, along with a date less than a year old. Close enough to the collision that her fingers stilled around the metal, without her quite understanding why yet. She opened the case with the delicate tool from her own leather roll, patient as her father had taught her to be with anything worth doing properly, and found, wedged deep among the gears where no casual glance would ever find it, a small folded scrap of paper, pressed tightly into the mechanism, and beside it, caught between 2 teeth of the escapement wheel itself, a tiny sliver of filed brass that did not belong to the watch at all. She worked the paper free and unfolded it by the window's pale light, and found it was not a long letter but a short, urgent note written in a hand grown unsteady with hurry, signed by a former railway clock inspector named Cyrus Fenwick, who explained that he had been sent to examine the very same station clock some months before the collision. Following a complaint, he had filed himself about irregular timekeeping. He could not immediately explain, and that in the course of his inspection he had found, and secretly removed for evidence, a metal filing identical in composition to the ones he now enclosed, evidence he intended to bring before the railway board directly, because he had already begun to suspect the new station master's hand in it. Fenwick wrote that before he could file his formal report, he had been abruptly reassigned to a distant line under paperwork citing budget reductions, and that he had hidden this proof inside his own broken watch, the one possession he trusted no clerk would ever think to search, intending to retrieve it once his transfer settled, only to fall seriously ill before he ever returned this way again. Rosalind sat a long while with the note and the filing in her palm, and she understood, with the same steady clarity her father had spent years teaching her to bring to any mechanism, that she was holding proof no ordinary inspector's report could argue against, proof that lived not in words alone but in the physical grain of the metal itself, comparable directly against the very tooth still sitting, filed and telling. Inside the station clock, the railway had never bothered to properly examine. In the morning, she wrapped the note and the filing carefully into a scrap of oiled cloth, tucked them into her tool roll alongside her own loop, and walked back toward Ashford Junction, not to plead her case quietly in an office, but to the depot itself, where a public inquiry into the collision was, by fortunate timing, still in session before the full railway board, and half the town crowded onto the platform to hear it. She asked and was granted 5 minutes to speak, and rather than simply hand over Fenwick's note to be read and set aside, she asked the board's own engineer to bring down the damaged clock mechanism itself. And there, in front of the assembled town, she opened the escapement with her father's tools and lifted out the very tooth the collision inquiry had blamed on ordinary wear, holding it beside Fenwick's preserved filing under the clear morning light so that anyone with eyes could see the two pieces of brass had been cut by the same file, at the same angle by the same deliberate hand. The crowd's murmur turned, within that single demonstration, from doubt into something closer to reckoning, and Horace Winslow, watching from the edge of the platform, understood before the board had even finished examining the metal, that his debts and his file marks had just been laid out, together in front of a town that would not soon forget the sight of a clockmaker's daughter taking apart the very mechanism that had ruined her, and reading its truth in front of them all. He fled that same night before any deputy reached his lodgings, and the railway board, faced with evidence no clerk's convenient conclusion could survive, restored Ezekiel Chase's contract and his good name within the same week, sending word west to bring him home. Rosalind reopened her father's shop with him that winter, and though the railway never fully recovered the money Winslow had already spent, the Chase name returned to every station clock along the line, and travelers passing through Ashford Junction came to know that the young woman behind the counter could read the truth inside any mechanism placed in front of her. Patient as her father had ever been, and twice as exacting, Rosalind Chase was 23 years old, and in the autumn, a railway's convenient judgment took her family's good name down with a collision that was never truly theirs to answer for. She had walked away from a board too eager to blame the nearest steady hands, carrying nothing but a leather roll of jeweler's tools and a watch of her own. She had never found time to finish. And inside a stranger's broken watch, left behind in a workshop nobody remembered, she had found not gold but the plain, patient, unbreakable proof that a mechanism built and kept with honest care will always, eventually tell the truth to the hand willing to open it. It was the truest hour she ever kept. If this story stayed with you, if you sat in that cold workshop with Rosalind, while the morning light moved across Cyrus Fenwick's hurried hand, take a moment before you go and tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And tell us, too, about the person in your own life who taught you that patience, applied carefully enough, can always take a lie apart. Threndal Stories tells the quiet, unwritten stories of the American frontier, the ones history left out, about the people who were counted out and came back anyway. Subscribe to keep walking this road with us, because the next quiet frontier tale is already waiting.